Imagine standing in London in the year 1944. No air raid sirens, no engine noise, no aircraft silhouettes overhead. Just a moment of absolute silence, and then an entire street disappears. There was no warning, no time to run into shelters. The weapon that struck did not fly like a bomber, did not roar like the V-1, and by the time it arrived, there was no possible way to shoot it down. My name is Ben Hodges. Today, we are not retelling the V-2 as some mythical super weapon. We are dissecting it as a real weapon system, its origins, its engineering, its battlefield performance, and the strategic legacy that military staffs around the world still grapple with to this day. The V-2 was born at a moment when Nazi Germany was slipping downward. After the Battle of Britain, the Luftwaffe's heavy bomber campaign failed to break the will of London. British radar networks, interceptors, and anti-aircraft artillery adapted so rapidly that Germany's air superiority eroded month after month. Meanwhile, German industry came under increasingly devastating Allied bombing. Berlin faced a paradox. It was losing the air war, yet still wanted to strike at the enemy's capital. The question placed on the table was not merely military, but psychological. If Germany could no longer dominate the skies, could it attack from outside the sky itself? The answer became the aggregate missile program at Peenemünde. The A1 and A2 were early prototypes. The A3 failed. The A5 became a test bed. And by the time engineers reached the A4, the technical designation for the V-2, the objective was clear: a single-stage liquid-fuel ballistic missile carrying roughly 1 metric ton of explosives with a range of over 250 kilometers, capable of striking London directly from continental Europe without a single aircraft. Compared to all alternative options, the V-2 represented a conceptual leap. The V-1 flying bomb was cheap and easy to mass produce, but it flew low, loudly, and was easily detected by radar and intercepted by fighters. Super heavy guns like the K5 or the V-3 project were constrained by terrain, fixed fortifications, and barrel limitations. The V-2, at least in theory, solved all these problems at once, launched from mobile platforms, arching high beyond the reach of anti-aircraft fire, and descending at nearly 1 kilometer per second. For that reason, the V-2's design philosophy carried a psychological dimension as significant as its physical one. Wernher von Braun and Walter Dornberger did not promise sniper-like accuracy. They promised a weapon that was almost impossible to stop, capable of striking deep into enemy cities, regardless of who controlled the skies. In modern terminology, the V-2 was the first real demonstration of a penetration strike weapon designed to bypass every existing layer of air defense. But behind the miracle weapon image lay a colder paradox: enormous cost, low accuracy, high civilian casualties, and widely debated military effectiveness. In the next section, we will set the propaganda aside and open up the V-2's core, its engine, its structure, its guidance system, and its deployment chain, everything that turned a laboratory blueprint into an actual missile leaving a launch table. Imagine standing beneath a V-2 rocket on an open launch field. What you see is not simply a missile, but nearly 13 metric tons of steel, propellant, and instrumentation compressed into a single integrated weapons system, taller than a 3-story building and roughly 1.68 meters in diameter. The V-2 was essentially a flying laboratory for 1940s technology. Its internal layout reflects a remarkably mature systems engineering mindset. At the nose sat the warhead, almost 1 metric ton, mounted on a reinforced frame and wrapped in thermal insulation to survive re-entry heating. Directly behind it lay the instrument compartment, gyroscopes, accelerometers, and analog controllers, the brain of the entire missile. The central section housed 2 massive tanks, water-diluted ethanol and liquid oxygen, which together made up the majority of the launch weight. At the tail was the engine bay, containing the turbopump, combustion chamber, and 4 graphite vanes positioned directly in the exhaust stream. The core of the system was its single-chamber liquid fuel engine, producing roughly 25 to 27 metric tons of thrust at sea level and rising to around 30 metric tons at altitude. The fuel was 75% ethanol mixed with water. The oxidizer was liquid oxygen cooled to approximately minus 183 degrees Celsius. Both were fed into the combustion chamber by a turbo pump driven by high-pressure steam generated from hydrogen peroxide decomposing over a catalyst. The engine used regenerative cooling. Ethanol circulated through the chamber walls before injection, simultaneously cooling the metal structure and improving efficiency. What truly distinguished the V-2 from all other wartime rockets was its inertial guidance system. The missile required no mid-course corrections from the ground. Gyroscopes maintained attitude and heading. Accelerometers measured longitudinal acceleration and integrated it over time to estimate velocity and distance traveled. The analog controller compared these inputs against a preset trajectory and moved the control surfaces accordingly. During the first crucial seconds after liftoff, when the missile was still slow and the surrounding air too thin for aerodynamic fins to be effective, steering relied primarily on the 4 graphite vanes inside the exhaust plume. By rotating these vanes, the system altered the thrust vector, an early rudimentary form of thrust vector control. As the V-2 accelerated and entered denser air, the aerodynamic tail fins gradually took over stabilization and course correction. The operational cycle of the V-2 fused rocket science with military organization. The missile body was assembled and inspected in rear area technical sites, then transported on a Vital wagon and transferred to a Mylar wagon for erection on a field launch stand. At the firing site, technical crews filled the tanks with liquid oxygen, ethanol, peroxide, and pressurized gas, while the guidance teams calibrated the gyroscopes and programmed range and azimuth parameters. From the moment a convoy arrived at a launch position to the moment the rocket left the rail, the process took roughly 1.5 to 2 hours fast by rocket engineering standards, but still a logistical burden for a military constantly targeted by Allied air attacks. Viewed through a systems logic lens, the V-2 was a synthesis of large propellant mass, liquid oxygen propulsion, high-thrust engines, thrust vectoring via graphite vanes, primitive inertial guidance, and a structure strong enough to withstand high acceleration and aerodynamic loads. It was not a standalone weapon, but a prototype architecture and ancestor to nearly every ballistic missile and space launch vehicle that followed. The V-2 is often described as 1 metric ton of explosives falling from the edge of space onto a city. In reality, its danger came not only from the amount of explosive it carried, but from the way chemical energy and kinetic energy combined at the moment of impact. The V-2 warhead weighed roughly 975 kilograms, of which about 910 kilograms were amytal, a mixture of trinitrotoluene and ammonium nitrate. It was not the most sophisticated explosive of the era, but it met 3 essential requirements. It was easy to mass produce, stable enough for transport, and highly effective at producing wide area blast effects in dense urban environments. When the warhead struck the ground at a terminal velocity of approximately 700 to 800 meters per second, it delivered enormous kinetic energy even before the chemical detonation occurred. The mechanical impact shattered structures, and the subsequent explosion completed the destruction. The V-2 had a range of roughly 270 to 320 kilometers, reaching apogees of 80 to 90 kilometers. Total flight time from launch to impact was around 5 to 6 minutes. Its velocity became supersonic early in flight, far exceeding the tracking and reaction capabilities of 1940s radar, anti-aircraft guns, and interceptor aircraft. On the spectrum of survivability against air defense, the V-2 was effectively untouchable. Its fatal flaw was accuracy. Using a purely mechanical, inertial guidance system, the circular error probable at maximum range could reach 2 to 5 kilometers. This made the V-2 completely unsuitable for striking point targets such as bridges, specific factories, or individual port facilities. It only made practical sense when the target was a large city where population density was high enough that even a miss of several kilometers would still cause casualties. Compared with the V-1 flying bomb, the V-2 was far more expensive but essentially immune to air defenses. Compared with super heavy artillery pieces like the K-5, it was less accurate but vastly more flexible in launch positioning and required no fixed installations. Compared with early Scud-type missiles, the V-2 was the ancestor, less refined, but containing all the fundamental principles: ballistic flight, heavy warheads, urban area attacks, and anti-defense penetration. By the metric of damage per shot, the V-2 was far less impressive than German propaganda claimed. But from a conceptual perspective, a long-range, uninterceptable weapon designed to strike metropolitan areas, the V-2 defined an entirely new class of armament, distinct from artillery, air power, or battlefield rockets. In imagery, the V-2 appears to be a mobile weapon launched from improvised field sites, seemingly able to fire from almost any patch of ground. But once you examine the logistical chain behind it, a paradox becomes clear. To launch a mobile missile, Germany had to bring an entire mobile laboratory to the front lines. A standard launch unit required dozens of vehicles and roughly 60 to 80 personnel directly involved in operations, excluding security, reconnaissance, communications, and auxiliary support. Teams were divided by specialization, airframe assembly, propellant and liquid oxygen handling, guidance calibration, launch control, and perimeter security. In total, maintaining a steady firing rhythm meant committing several hundred personnel to each cluster of launch sites. Training requirements were exceptionally high. Propellant crews had to handle liquid oxygen at minus 183 degrees Celsius and high concentration hydrogen peroxide, both exceedingly hazardous. Engine teams needed to understand turbopump mechanics, piping systems, and regenerative cooling loops. Guidance crews were required to work with geodetic data and perform gyroscope alignment under field conditions. This was not a system where new conscripts could simply be plugged in and expected to operate effectively. The launch preparation workflow was equally complex. The Meilerwagen erected the missile. Ethanol, liquid oxygen, peroxide, and pressurized gas lines were connected. Liquid oxygen was loaded first for thermal stabilization, followed by ethanol. Pressure levels and sealing were checked, and the guidance system was calibrated and programmed. Only when all parameters reached acceptable thresholds were fueling lines disconnected, support vehicles withdrawn, and the engine start sequence initiated. On paper, the 90 to 120-minute timeline from convoy arrival to missile launch was an impressive engineering achievement. But in the context of a Germany under constant Allied air attack, it was a dangerously long window for aerial reconnaissance and bombers to locate and strike the soft links of the system, the convoys and the launch site infrastructure. The operational cost of the V-2 extended far beyond each individual missile. It required SS-100 tractor units, a liquid oxygen production and distribution network, ethanol supplies that competed with civilian demand, geodetic support facilities, the underground middlework factory, and a core of highly skilled technicians. When placed on the strategic balance sheet, the V-2 resembled a national mega project, far more than a simple long-range artillery round. When the V-2 entered combat in September 1944, it was not used to break defensive lines or disrupt ground operations. Instead, it was fired almost exclusively at cities, London, Antwerp, Liège, and several others. In other words, the front line of the V-2 was above civilian populations, not on the battlefield. London absorbed more than 1,000 V-2 strikes, resulting in thousands of deaths and injuries. Antwerp, then, the principal Allied logistics port, became a priority target, suffering multiple high-casualty attacks, including the infamous strike on the Rex Cinema. Yet even in these concentrated campaigns, the V-2 exposed an uncomfortable reality. Its technical failure rate was extremely high. A significant number of missiles exploded shortly after launch, veered off course by tens of kilometers, or even fell back into German-held territory. From a tactical standpoint, the V-2 destroyed no critical bridges, halted no rail corridors, and stopped no Allied armored formations. From a psychological and political standpoint, however, the effects were more pronounced. For Londoners, already battered by years of bombing, being attacked by a weapon they could not hear, could not see, and could not shoot down generated a distinct sense of helplessness. For the British government, political pressure increased, but not enough to alter war policy or weaken national resolve. The Allies quickly reached a strategic conclusion. The V-2 could not be intercepted in flight, so the only viable countermeasure was to attack the missile before or after its trajectory, meaning its production centers, assembly facilities, and launch sites. Air raids on Peenemünde, the Middelwerk underground factory, transportation networks, and launch areas in the Netherlands proved far more effective than any attempt at direct air defense. Post-war investigation committees assembled a stark data set. On average, fatalities per V-2 were far lower than its production and deployment cost would justify. Measured in casualties per unit of expenditure, the V-2 performed worse than the simpler, cheaper V-1 flying bomb. This did not mean the V-2 was useless. It achieved secondary objectives, forcing the Allies to redirect resources toward a new threat, applying psychological pressure, and most importantly, demonstrating that long-range ballistic attack was technologically feasible. But it did not alter the trajectory of a war Germany had already lost in production capacity, fuel availability, manpower, and control of the skies. On the battlefields of the Second World War, the V-2 was an expensive weapon with limited effectiveness, but over a longer historical arc, it became the starting point of an entirely new era. This is the strategic paradox of the V-2. A short-term failure, but a long-term victory in shaping military thought. The V-2 delivered the first major blow to traditional air defense doctrine. Before it, all air defense systems assumed targets would fly within the atmosphere at subsonic or low supersonic speeds. The V-2 vaulted to the edge of space and then fell at supersonic velocity far outside the comfort zone of contemporary radar, anti-aircraft guns, and fighter aircraft. This forced military planners to consider an entirely new defensive architecture: long-range early warning, space-based tracking, and eventually ballistic missile defense. After 1945, what Berlin failed to achieve with the V-2 was pushed to its logical extreme by Washington and Moscow. Both superpowers viewed V-2 technology as a strategic asset. The United States acquired von Braun and his team. The Soviet Union acquired the production lines, the designs, and the remaining German technicians. From there, the world entered a new sequence: medium-range missiles, intercontinental ballistic missiles, nuclear warheads, culminating in the deterrent framework of mutually assured destruction. The V-2 also reshaped how smaller nations perceived military power. If a medium-range missile could strike an enemy capital without a global navy, missile forces suddenly became an attractive option for states that could not compete in aircraft carriers or strategic bombers. This logic fueled the development of the Scud, Shahab, Hwasong, and similar missile families, using ballistic missiles as asymmetric deterrence tools. In the realm of space, the V-2 was humanity's first real step upward. Many of the world's earliest near-space scientific experiments were conducted using captured V-2 seconds after the war. The Redstone Jupiter and R-7 lines all carried direct traces of V-2 architecture, eventually leading to the Saturn V, the Soyuz family, and the modern intercontinental ballistic missile. If it must be summarized in one sentence, the V-2 did not change the outcome of the Second World War, but it changed the structure of military power for the entire post-war era. Today, no modern air force or army fields a V-2 inches its order of battle. But no missile command on Earth can ignore its intellectual legacy. The V-2 was a strategic prototype, crude, expensive, incomplete, but containing the foundational principles the world has spent the last 80 years refining. Many of Germany's follow-on projects never progressed beyond paper. The A-4B with gliding wings, the A-9 divided by A-10-2, stage concept designed for transatlantic range. Yet the ideas, ballistic ascent followed by atmospheric glide, or very long-range two-stage missiles, were revived almost immediately by the United States and the Soviet Union after 1945. From the R1 to the R5 and R7, from Redstone and Jupiter to Saturn, every generation of missiles delivered more complete answers to questions the V-2 had only begun to pose. Over the next 5 to 15 years, missile technology trends will still revolve around principles the V-2 already proved: autonomous guidance, hard-to-intercept trajectories, mobile deployment, and tight integration between propulsion, guidance, flight profile, and logistics. The difference today lies in vastly superior materials, far more efficient engines, and guidance systems, accurate enough to strike a single building, not just an entire city. The V-2 will never be reborn as a modern weapon system. It is thoroughly outclassed by solid fuel missiles, digital guidance, and multi-role warheads. But its core concepts, long-range ballistic attack, the decoupling of strike power from air superiority, and the ability to place a city under strategic threat, remain embedded in every contemporary war plan. In overall assessment, the V-2's strengths lay in how far it advanced concepts and technology ahead of its time. Liquid fuel engines, inertial guidance, thrust, vector control, and full system integration in a field-deployable weapon. Its weaknesses were rooted in the era that produced it, an era too resource-starved to sustain such a system and still win a total war. Perhaps the fairest way to close the story of the V-2 is this: it was not the weapon that helped Germany win the war, but the weapon that forced the rest of the world to rethink how wars would be fought. From the moment the first V-2 lifted off from Peenemünde, distance, altitude, and time ceased to be the exclusive domain of aircraft and became the domain of missiles. And we continue to live in the world shaped by that shift.